Most of the time, the architecture becomes a bottleneck, and that bottleneck gets propagated into all the other parts of the business.
A fact that easily overlooked are like non-functional requirements. Everyone is so focused on defining the requirements, defining your roadmap in terms of identifying various releases, various iterations, sprints, and whatnot. But non-functional requirements are sometimes not even like discussed or like not even like documented anywhere.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Our Tech Chronicles. We have a good topic in store for you guys today. We're going to talk about when is the right time to re-architect your software. We get asked this question a lot, and we thought it'll make a good episode to just share with you guys our experiences. We are going to explore different topics. One is identifying the signs when is the right time to do this re-architecture. We're going to talk about the business case. How do you manage your stakeholders? What is it? How can we convince them that it is the right time to do it? We're going to talk about technical approaches for all you tech leads and architects out there going through this right now, different methodologies or patterns or techniques you could use. And we'll end with pitfalls, challenges, and maybe some war stories, lessons learned. Sounds good?
Sounds
Yep,
good.
all good.
Maybe we start off with identifying signs. When is the right time to re-architect?
Yeah, so I'll start with that, and then we'll go around the table to get your opinion. So this is a quite common problem. Most of the time, the architecture becomes a bottleneck, and that bottleneck gets propagated into all the other parts of the business. Uh, However, because a business is a machine of people, technology, process all involved, sometimes the people and the process compensate for the technology, and you don't see the real gap until someone put effort to identify it, right? Once that identification is done, you need some sort of justification to come to that point. Okay, we need to change or re-architect our solution at this point of time. I think that at a high level, that's what it is. Between the people, process, technology, the architecture falls under the technology element of it. In certain other cases where you have a process which disturbs or which becomes a bottleneck, sometimes it's your people that creates the bottleneck. So getting that clear view of what's creating that bottleneck is important, whether it's a process problem, whether it's related to your service design, the way you operate your business, or whether it's related to the people and the skills and how you architect the business, or is it purely technical? And if you figure out it's technical, that's a trigger point for you to start thinking about changing or replacing architecture. That's very high level view I can get to you. Up to you guys.
I,
How do you
yeah,
understand it?
I can share a little bit about my experiences as well. We've done it a few times. In my experience, I've seen it happening for five different reasons, right? So one is as in your company, in your organization, you have tech debt overload. What that means is your teams are spending more time doing maintenance than actually building new features. Have you guys heard of RTB versus CTB? So you're spending more time on run the business rather than innovation, right? So that's a good sign that something has to change. Two, for me, is very similar to what you said, Anjana, is your system is not scaling. There are performance bottlenecks, and it's impacting how your internal or external users perceive the system, right? Causing frustration, whatever. Third one is business alignment, right? Your current system cannot support the new needs of the business or what the market demands. So you got to make a change. The fourth one is, the fourth one is your system is using obsolete technologies that are not supported anymore. And it's a massive risk to continue running that because if something goes wrong, it's going to cause an outage or some big problem to your organization. And the last one is an interesting one. It's developer productivity. So teams are slowed down by complicated code bases, and so not making changes fast enough, or the code base is so fragile that they're scared to touch it because they don't know where or what will go wrong, right? So that's another reason why we would want to, rethink the system and re-architect it. What do you
And
guys think?
so, yeah, I was going to say this whole context is definitely multidimensional, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the other dimensions I think we could overlay, which is very relevant, is being reactive versus proactive, right? In my experience, most of the situations where I have been brought in to kind of rescue like an architecture, so to speak, has been obviously like someone reacting to like an immediate failure, some big issue. But if you really kind of start dissecting or getting to the bottom of like these problems, bulk of it could have been avoided if you take like a more proactive approach, right? You kind of have like some processes in place to do like frequent checks against like anything, any kind of matrices you might have, do some advanced testing. And we are going to talk about like some of these elements. So I won't go into like specific details at this point, but I think that is kind of like another dimension to kind of look at. And we can talk about like some specific examples around some of the more popular like failures in the recent past, including like last week with what happened with like a popular streaming service, right? And yeah, so we can definitely kind of explore how to be more proactive and like how to overcome certain issues way before like it reaches something.
So I would like to build on, I think, what Yuresh, Anjan, and Roshan said. Some areas to really think about is from a business perspective, right? So how do you really balance out speed to market as a startup, really get your product out, get revenue in, and build the recurring revenue as soon as possible, right? And then to really balance that with building good architecture and making sure that there is no debt in your code base? Are you using the best technologies? That real balance is the tough one especially for startups, right? So I think you would see in your first maybe 1 to 2 years where you're just running basically on meeting your investor demands, or basically if you're running after funding. So how do you really get this product out? How do you kind of growth hack it into the next phase, right? But then at some point, like Roshan explained on the 2 or 3 points, there are always the maintainability issues that come about. You are spending far more time on just maintaining your product rather than innovating. And once that happens, you really have to take that call from a business perspective, right? So you can't, at that point, scaling your product really starts limiting. And then kind of shifting gears into the different mode of cleaning up and doing the re-architecture, etc., that comes about with it. So those are some of my thoughts around it.
Those are good thoughts, Dehanta. I think one thing us technologists generally are challenged with is maybe we identify that there's a need for a re-architecture. How do we communicate that to our stakeholders, the C-suite? No one really funds a re-architecture because business has to continue operating, right? So, like, what do you look for, Ehanta? How should someone present it to you, and what outcomes are you looking for
So,
to say
so
yes?
in
This is the
my
right thing to
case,
do.
both times, the latter part of the startup that I was involved in, from a business case perspective, was scalability, right? When the business was not able to scale and grow at the rate that we felt it could, especially in multi-regions on the cloud, we really knew that if we didn't architecture the whole platform, we would be dead. So it's a balance from a perspective for me was the scalability. So as soon as we saw that limitation, we needed, okay, look, it's time that we invest in the re-architecture, right? But it's a tough one because most business people would want to, essentially do the unlimited scaling, not add extra cost, make sure that we are making money from building your annual recurring revenue, or ARR as we call it SaaS-based startups, and making sure that that growth is maintained, right? It's also tougher because you need to go and tell your board that you need to take a step back and for us to scale to the next level, right? That's the tougher conversation, in my opinion, because sometimes they're like, hey, no, we need to meet your next investor numbers. We need to ensure that we hit this ARR. If not, we are not going to be able to raise our next round. So those are some of the balances that you need to hit.
Cool. I
Nice.
think
Thanks for sharing.
I like to bring a perspective. So we discussed when to clearly define when not to go for a change of architecture, right? So that part is ultra clear. I think we can talk about it. So don't do it when you want to win a holy war. Like for instance, I'm a Java guy and this company's been operating on .NET. Don't do it for that reason. That's one wrong reason to do architecture, right? Because of a technology that you prefer. Or also don't do it to add something to your profile into your CV in the days to come. For instance, I have worked on service oriented, but I haven't worked on microservices. I need to add that to my CV. So I am going to change my entire organization architecture to microservices. Definitely no. Also, don't do it simply because you go for a tech conference and there is a new platform, new JavaScript framework, something new. It's very promising. You only read the marketing material. You come home, you're motivated. Next day, you want to change it. Definitely no, right? So the list can go on, but in summary, this is not a impulsive decision. This is the decision that you have to think through, lay out properly, get multiple people's opinion, right? So I think that's what it is when it comes to when not to change or replace your architecture.
I would definitely add to that with an extra couple of points. It's as unpopular as that could be. Like company politics come into picture sometimes too, right? Especially in a big organization, you would have these multiple verticals of um, um, technologies or cross sections of like industries versus technology. And there's like a lot of influence that comes with it, right? Like, so depending on like how strong like that vertical is, they might suggest like one technology or the other. And as unfortunate as it is, like that could be due to like some level of like an agreement they have like with like a certain vendor. So then like you are kind of driven towards like an emotion or like a financial based decision rather than like a technology based decision that steers like the architecture way. So when purely like from a technology point of view, like architects have to kind of get involved like to steer it or like course correct the right way to, I mean, it's not easy like to change someone's decision, especially if it is coming from like the higher up, right? So it's a matter of like bringing out like the right information to say like if we do this, like here are like the things that we are going to face, like here's like why it would fail, and have to kind of take like a more emotionless decision, purely looking at from like technology point of view, like to re-architect or like define that architecture.
Yuresh, that's the perfect segue because our next section is techniques, methodologies, things that patterns, that, how to do it, right?
How to
Yeah.
do it, right? I think that's a very good point. Now, when it comes to how to, you need a clear approach because it's not as simple as drawing some boxes in a diagram and simply saying this is what we want. This is a generic approach that has worked for me. The first step is doing an architecture assessment. So we all gonna agree we need a assessment of the current architecture, and we define against what criteria that we're gonna assess this architecture. The criteria list is quite generic. Most of the time it's common, but however the weightage that you give could be different. So that's where you bring a more democratic approach where you create sort of a spreadsheet. This is the criteria and the weightage from different departments from different perspectives. It could be from the ops team versus the go-to-market teams versus the technology owners and all that, right? So then it's a weightage, and you could sort of calculate and normalize those weightages. against your. So then you perform your architecture assessment. It could be based on the very scientific pattern with things like performance, which you can measure, and also there are non-scientific elements like the speed, right, which is a subjective term. Things like that. It depends on how they perceive how fast or slow this system react or respond to their business needs. So you bring all of that. That's your assessment. So that's step number one, to starting with the assessment. Once you get an assessment done, before you go into your architecture effort, the second point that you need to do is set your guiding principles. When you set the guiding principles, you bring alignment across the organization. Whenever there is a disconnect, whenever there is a disagreement, we can always go back to the guiding principle and say, hey, according to the guiding principle, we have to favor this option versus the other, so that everyone knows this is not, the decisions are not based on, there's no favorism, it's based on the guiding principle. So put some effort and set the guiding principles. Like for instance, guiding principle, example of a guiding principle could be the operational visibility. Whatever the system we do, we need very clear operational flexibility on that, and to a great extent. And another guiding principle could be build versus buy. What components to buy, what to build. It's part of the guiding principle. The technology stack is part of the guiding principle because the organization has certain, and every organization has a limited set of skills, right? You can't have everything. So those are guiding principles. And whenever there's new shiny thing to be discussed, you can align it with the guiding principle. So that's how you start, and there are other techniques I'll talk down the line, but that's probably the way you start. And what are your thoughts? How would you start something like this?
We follow exactly what you suggested. The assessment guiding principles, very very important. That's where you align everyone. But we also encourage early feedback loops, because remember, this is an architecture. It's very assumption based, right? And you make decisions along the way. You want to be able to prove those decisions, and if the assumptions don't hold, then you want to be able to be nimble enough to make adjustments as you progress. So that's another thing we just encourage teams to follow as well. In addition to that, so like no big bang. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I
So
can add
yes,
one
go
more
ahead.
point to it real quick, but before that, a quick message to our viewers. If you want to follow these types of conversations along the way, please hit that subscribe button right now. So yeah, along the lines of like guiding principles, one thing that is overlooked purely from like a software team point of view, and I have noticed this both whether you are like a technology company or like a non-technology company, right? A fact that easily overlooked are like non-functional requirements. Like everyone is so focused on like defining the requirements, like kind of defining like your roadmap in terms of like identifying various releases, various iterations, sprints, and whatnot. But like non-functional requirements are like sometimes not even like discussed or like not even like documented anywhere. Like so definitely purely from like an architecture point of view, it is like an important aspect to bring that to the conversation, kind of start identifying them as early as possible. And then like that would be like purely like a like one of the targets you try to achieve while defining that architecture or like re-architecting your solution.
Yeah, that's a good point. The assessment of the current architecture, it's functional, non-functional, as well as the experiential part of it. How people experience once we build this system. So all those have to sort of bundled in the assessment part of it. So that's just to bring the of the assessment and the set the guiding principles. Uh, then we come to a stage where we have to really start designing, right? And what tools, techniques can help you during that when part of it.
And just one more thing, can I, if you don't mind me interrupting, just to add on the guiding principles. So from a business perspective, if I remember right, we set ourselves things like deployment time of the system. It should be done without any help from anybody should be able to do it. The cost of running, so we were a cloud POS provider. So we looked at the cost of running each instance on the cloud, right? So, I mean, how can we bring it down to less than like $5? So those are some of also the guiding principles, sorry, $5 per month, right? So, but these are the areas that from a business perspective that you also need to set on the guiding principles. So sorry to interrupt you, Anjana, but over to you.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah. So in the next stage, there are a few tools and techniques that I have used to actually find as much as possible reference architectures. So that gives a very good sense of how other people have solved this problem. You might not be able to find a direct one-to-one match, but at least you can find quite a few reference architectures in this particular domain, which you can also see some of the capabilities that is yet to come, which you haven't really discussed within your team. But in the reference architecture, those can be found. The other angle is any architecture is debatable. That's a point that we need to understand, right? So how we put that into a form where we can all compare is we bring a concept called trade-off analysis. So in the trade-off analysis, when you compare architecture, you bring things what we call abilities, like scalability, agility, non-functional capabilities. All abilities are what architectural characteristics that you compare it against. So you bring all that into a trade-off analysis. So then you bring your architecture sort of into that trade-off analysis and see where you are. For instance, if you are a startup and you need a low cost solution, what Tehant sort of mentioned, the lower cost versus agility. Agility is how fast you can change things, and your go to market speeds, deployment type of variables. You bring all that, and then you compare. Then you keep comparing against some of the architectures that you can think of. So that trade-off gives you, at least you know why you have chosen this architecture over the other. You have that clarity. So that's probably the most important thing for me, having that trade-off, so that we don't go over and over. We don't discuss the same thing as to why we did this over the other. We did use this architecture pattern. That's all important to visualize and sort of agree upon somewhat upfront. And you can do this trade-off analysis at different stages as well.
This is spot on, Anjana. This is excellent guidance. Just to add to the trade-off analysis, right? So even for us, whenever we do something like this, there's a lot of thinking that happens up front. So like you said, the trade-off analysis, one tool or technique we do is you analyze all the things that you're going to do, and the most riskiest ones, we actually run POCs, very lightweight, like POs, proof of concept builds, just to prove out the theory versus what it is actually like, and try and scale it and just test it out, battle test it a bit, and bring it back to the trade-off analysis. So now we have more data, some information to make a better informed decision before we invest. So, but the POC is very lightweight. It's not like built with all the tech stack that you decide. It's something just built just to prove the connectivity or some decision that you made.
Yeah, but yeah, having if you have the time to do a POC, is it gives you really fast feedback and also confidence among the team of what you're
Evidence.
trying to build. So as we know, building architecture, sometimes you have to do it in a very limited period of time. So of course you scope it, right? You build a limited set of features, and then you plan to build the rest later. But what happens is either that later never comes, or even you get free time down the line. Now you don't have a plan. You don't know where to start. So good technique to sort of guide you through that is to have to create a architecture blueprint. So architecture blueprint is sort of a very high level design guide as to what components would eventually come into your architecture and what areas that you would tackle. And your current architecture is a subset of that based on the time and the cost and all that efforts. So that when you have some time, you know at least, okay, these are the rest of the items that I have not focused on in my blue.
Right.
And you can start picking up those and add it into your
Right.
sprints and get that done, which becomes a sort of a roadmap for the technical architecture, because I don't think any organization can build a complete architecture that can support the whole stack at once, right? So having that blueprint and also keep adding things to that blueprint, that becomes your backlog, so to speak. Those are two other areas that sort of will help you to keep it going.
That's a great segue, Anjana. Shall we move on to discuss like challenges, pitfalls, maybe some wars? If you think about challenges and pitfalls, what I've experienced, one of the biggest challenges is when you start on this re-architecture journey, scope creep. Now that what you thought that you can do, people start piling on, hey, add this, add that. And if you don't manage it well, it could take even much longer.
So that's
Right.
What else have
that
you
is
guys?
that is exactly where the death of cost comes into play, right? Especially early stage or even mid stage sometimes.
Yeah.
So you'd be very careful of over adding features that are not core, really focusing on what are the features that you had today, because customers are not going to take a product that is going to be have lesser features than what you had yesterday. But you have to at some point take a decision to say, hey, these set of features are going to only come for you in 6 months. They may be non-critical, but you have to take that tough call of saying, okay, I'm going to potentially stop development on code base A, and I'm going to focus on code base B. These are costs that we're going to allocate, but it's going to have the same set of features that are going to have in uh, code A.
Yep, and the
Okay.
same applies for on the technology overlay part too, right? Like because all these buzzwords and like the best of the best technologies come into picture, and like someone would want like everything at once, right? But that's where like all these parameters and the blueprints that we were talking about earlier comes into picture, like why it matters. You can like really do an assessment. Like so, for example, let's say like I'm trying to beef up my technology stack to handle like an X amount of transactions, right? On an average, just to make up like an example, let's say like you only need to handle like up to 1,000 transactions per second, right? Just to throw like some number out there. So you're not going to gain much by trying to handle like 100,000 transactions per second in if your situation is like never going to hit even like a halfway point, right? So you need to like really take like a more deeper analytical view as to like do we really need this at this point, or do we even like need it ever, right? So like I told like one of my clients once, like Amazon.com did not become Amazon.com on day one. Like all the features they have built over the years did not happen overnight, did not happen within like the first month. So like you really need to kind of steer or like guide like the conversations as architects to kind of make the decision makers like kind of think from those points of view.
Agreed. A couple more challenges I've experienced. One is our favorite topic, estimation, uncertainty around that, right? We never quite get it just right. So we have to manage those expectations with our stakeholders around that. And another one is an interesting one. I don't know if you face this, is sometimes team resistance. So remember, a large architecture has several different teams working on it, right? And some teams are, they are attached to their current system because they built it, perhaps, right? And there's a little bit of resistance in making changes, and it's like a jigsaw puzzle, doing their part so that it fits in with the rest of the architecture. So that's another challenge or something to watch out for.
Right. And just to echo
Yeah.
on that, like I think we kind of touched upon this earlier, like various types of bringing like the various skill sets into picture, right? Like so purely from an architecture point of view, like to Roshan's point, like if you have like these multiple teams or multiple verticals working on different different components of like a solution, you need to have like one person who's going to have like that bird's eye view, thinking end to end. Sometimes you might just assign an architect for each vertical. They're only going to like focus on that vertical, but you need that cross connection, the crosscut view to make sure that like how do we maintain stability across the board? Like how do we make sure that if one component fails, how does it like self-recover? How is that customer experience going to look like? All those aspects, right? Like so bringing like the right resources at the right time matters quite a lot, like even from like an architecture point of view.
Actually, I have something to add to that. So if you take a really large enterprise, bring in one architect who knows it all is really, really hard. Even that bird's eye view is very complicated. There are lots of moving pieces, lots of platforms, tech involved in those. So what has worked in the past for me in such setup is we set up what we call the ARB, Architecture Review Board. And all the architects, it's like the Scrum of Scrum. It's the meeting of all the architects or the lead architects. It's a more of a conclave meeting where they do a submission to the RB as to what's the change, what they're trying to do, repercussions, options, cost implications, all that. And that's discussed in multidimensional fashion where from an operational point of view, from a cost point of view, from a adaptation, from go to market, all those variables are discussed in the ARB. So forming an ARB when you work with a large group of architects in that team structure is a requirement. And making sure you empower the right guys in the ARB, the architecture review board, to make that decision so that you don't take a decision which is biased to one team or one silo. So that's how you solve that problem, because sometimes one architect can't see it all. Right? To make sense is to set that governing body, which is ARP.
That's great. Yep, it's a good pattern. Just to wrap up, do we want to? We've all done this. So, do we want to share some lessons learned, having gone through this a few times? What worked, what didn't work, what did you pivot on, stuff like that. I can go first if you like. So in my current company, so we went through this re-architecture of moving from a monolith into a microservices based architecture, right? Massive operation. We are just one of honestly many companies that do this. Most famous one is probably Netflix, that happened some time back. I think they've written many articles. Like you said, Anjana, reference architectures. We read all the documentation and learned from them, right? So some of the things that we followed is, one, especially moving from monolith to microservices, we focused on building resiliency from day one. So that means fail fast, fail safe, design systems for failure so that they can handle it gracefully, right? It operates in a degraded manner. There's no downtime. And so we use tools like Chaos Monkey to test this out constantly. It's part of the build process. Two, I would say, is we definitely didn't do a big bang approach because, like Hanta said, the business has to still continue, right? So we followed a pattern called the strangler pattern, where we took like sets of services, decomposed from the monolith, build them into microservices, set them out. So parity was always maintained, right? So customers are not seeing the new experience being degraded or something like that, or less than what they expected. And the last point I would want to end on is there was a cultural shift, right? We all moved from one code base where some team tests and releases to now every team owning that microservice themselves. We follow this thing called you build it, you run it. So that means they design, they build, they test, they ship, and they go on call for that service. They can't pass the buck to anyone else. That culture shift also had to happen when we made this change. I would love to hear your experiences as well.
From a business perspective, I think don't shortchange yourself on good architectures right at the start. I think that's a mistake that we made, and I think that cost us a lot over the duration of our startup. But I think once you have that initial part, at least at a certain level, a solid foundation definitely helps the scalability and also helps the organization on costs. running your operation optimally, having, customers being kept happy, reducing your support calls, all of that definitely has good architecture has a direct impact on all of this. So it definitely helps your business overall, and ensures that you have the short term as well as the medium term goals met. And this is something that is a tough call, especially early stage. But once you have to put your mind to it, and I think once that is done, the impact is greater. And I think over a 5 to 6 year period, you will really see that come in. If you're able to run a platform to 5 to 6 years without having to re-architecture it, and if you've done that in your very early stage, I think that's a learning. If I do say, that's a real learning for me over the years.
Wise words, Ehanta. Wise words. Maybe we can end on that. Good discussion,
All right.
guys.
Thank you,
As
everybody.
always. Thank
It
you.
was great talking and great to be part
Thank
of
you.
this.
Thanks, guys.